An elderly gentleman wearing a navy cap was asked to change his seat without any explanation. Most travelers remained quiet until the pilot rose, walked to the back, and showed him the respect that no one else had offered. Henry T. Marchant was not the type to ask for much. At 76, his knees were not as strong as before, yet he moved with the steady presence of someone who had spent his life earning admiration without raising his voice. He waited patiently in the line at Gate 6 of Middle Georgia Regional Airport, one hand holding his boarding pass, the other resting gently on the handle of a simple black suitcase. He wore a brown cardigan, trousers ironed earlier that morning, and a Navy veteran cap with faded golden letters. It did not demand attention, but it did not need to. Some people noticed, most did not. Henry did not mind either way. Flight 228 to Colorado Springs was almost full. This was not a holiday. He was traveling to meet his newborn great-grandson. His granddaughter Rachel had called him a week earlier, her voice shaking with emotion, saying, "Papa, I want you to be the first to hold him after me. You're the reason I got through everything." That message alone was enough for him to buy the ticket that same night. As Henry walked along the jet bridge, a flight attendant greeted the passengers with practiced cheerfulness. "Good morning, welcome aboard." He nodded quietly, no smile, not out of disrespect, just because he never saw the point in pretending feelings that were not sincere. In seat 12B by the aisle, he stowed his carry-on in the overhead compartment and eased into the chair with a soft sigh. From his coat pocket, he drew out a worn paperback whose title had faded long ago, yet he still knew every single word. The seat next to him was empty, while the window seat was occupied by a teenage girl, already completely absorbed by her phone. The middle seat was free as well, which he preferred. However, within less than 5 minutes, a different flight attendant approached. This one was younger, with a blonde ponytail pulled taut, clutching a clipboard, while her eyes scanned the cabin anxiously. "Sir," she said with a firm but courteous tone, "I need to ask you to move to another seat due to a last-minute change." He looked up, confused. "Ma'am, I am in 12B, and that is what my ticket says." She responded promptly, "Yes, I realize, but there has been a seating error and someone else must be assigned to this row. Would you mind relocating to a seat farther back?" He blinked in surprise. "Is there a problem with this one?" She hesitated slightly before smiling. "No, nothing wrong. Just a reassignment. We truly appreciate your understanding." The girl in the window seat didn't even glance up. Nearby passengers had suddenly fallen silent while a tall man in seat 14A, probably in his mid-30s, observed intently. Shrugging, he stood up slowly. "All right, no problem." He reached for his bag, but she halted him. "You can leave that up there. We'll bring it to you." Raising an eyebrow, he asked, "Is that really necessary?" She answered, "It's just easier that way, sir." She guided him down the aisle toward the rear of the plane, and as they walked, another flight attendant was assisting a man in a suit with salt and pepper hair to settle into seat 12B. He appeared annoyed, as if he had paid for extra comfort and refused to accept anything less. Henry T. Marchant remained silent as they reached the final row. The attendant motioned, "Right here, seat 31E, aisle seat." He took his place this time next to the restroom. The air felt somewhat heavier in the back, but Henry did not complain. He rested the paperback on the tray table, tilted his head back, and gazed upward at the ceiling. Several rows ahead, the man in seat 14A, Thomas Grant, leaned toward the woman beside him. "Did you notice that?" he whispered. She barely responded. He had a seat assigned. That was his place. Thomas shook his head, narrowing his eyes toward 31E. Henry closed his eyes briefly. The background noise of boarding quieted down. He was not angry, only weary. Weary of these fleeting moments when people chose to ignore you. Yet something about today would change, even though Henry was unaware. The plane's engines were humming as the last passengers boarded. Flight attendants moved along the aisle with practiced motions, checking latches and closing overhead bins, their smiles polite but not sincere. Still, Thomas Grant in 14A did not notice any of this. His eyes remained fixed toward the rear, oblivious to Henry T. Marchant's presence. Henry T. Marchant had never encountered him before that day, but something about the way the elderly man calmly accepted being moved aside unsettled Thomas Grant. "Excuse me," he said, catching the attention of a flight attendant passing by. It was not the same crew member who had assisted Henry. This woman appeared older and more seasoned, evident from the wrinkles framing her mouth. "May I ask, was there genuinely a mistake with that seat assigned to the gentleman in 12B? She paused. "I am sorry, sir. I do not have all the information at the moment. Let me verify," she replied, and walked away before Thomas could continue. Thomas exhaled and eased into his seat in row 31. Henry carefully folded his jacket over his knees. He never liked creasing it even when no one was watching. That jacket had witnessed weddings, funerals, and 3 commencements. He gazed ahead, trying to ignore the flashing toilet sign nearby. Just a few feet away, a toddler was already crying uncontrollably 2 seats down. 1 row above, a woman sporting a neck pillow was video calling until a crew member firmly instructed her to end the call. No one made eye contact. Henry reached for his book once more but did not open it. Instead, he stared at the back of the seat before him as if it might reveal something more captivating. In 12B, the new occupant, a man dressed in a sharp blazer with noise-canceling headphones, casually sipped from a branded water bottle while scrolling through his phone. He appeared comfortable, self-assured, and completely unaware. The flight attendant with the ponytail checked on him twice before departure, but never glanced back at Henry. Thomas reached his limit and pressed the call button, which glowed yellow. The same ponytailed flight attendant appeared. "Yes, sir. I am sorry. I am just trying to understand," Thomas said. "That man back in number 31 had this seat. Why was he moved?" She offered a rehearsed smile. "There was a last-minute adjustment, sir." "What kind of adjustment?" "I am not allowed to share passenger information. Please understand, we strive to ensure everyone is seated comfortably." Thomas nodded toward seat number 12B. She did not react. "I'm afraid that is all I can tell you. If there is anything else you need, please let me know." "There is nothing else," he replied. Then she walked away as if nothing had happened. The doors closed, and the engine noise became louder. A voice came over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 2228 with service to Colorado Springs. Flight duration today will be approximately 3 hours and 15 minutes. Henry heard none of it. He was not resentful. He never allowed himself to be. But he did remember. He recalled a bus in Macon in 1964. He remembered a hospital waiting room where no one spoke to him. He recalled standing in line in uniform, being overlooked repeatedly. It did not defeat him then, and it would not now, but it stayed with him. In the cockpit, Captain Roy Delaney glanced at the passenger list one final time. The name Henry T. Marchant did not stand out, but the handwritten note in the corner caught his eye. A discreet message from a gate agent. Former Navy veteran. Captain preferred row 12B, moved. Delaney frowned as this was not the usual procedure. Experienced passengers were typically given priority and not reassigned without reason. He decided to remind himself to investigate this matter once they were airborne. Meanwhile, in seat 31E, Henry T. Marchant at last opened his book, its pages worn and some corners folded. Still, reading soothed him as it always had. He did not crave sympathy, just some personal space. His story had been written long before this journey. Yet someone aboard the plane had just recognized that Henry was no ordinary silent traveler, and they were determined to address it. The aircraft began moving onto the runway, engines roaring loudly as the cabin gently shook, and the seatbelt lights flickered above. Thomas Grant leaned back, gripping the armrest tighter than normal. His intuition told him this was not a simple mistake or a rushed seat change. It felt intentional, and even worse, it felt strangely familiar. He glanced down the aisle toward row 31, barely seeing Henry's head above the seatbacks. The man was neither slumped nor withdrawn. He sat upright, eyes fixed on the window, still holding the same book in his lap. Thomas had not spoken, but his silence started to feel like agreement. Nearby, a woman around her 50s whispered to her husband, "I saw him sit there first. He did nothing wrong." Her husband responded with a grunt, irritated but unwilling to intervene. Soon the plane lifted with a strong surge, entering the sky. A toddler yelled briefly from the rear, and a bell rang as the seatbelt sign switched off. The crew then began rolling out the beverage carts. As people settled into movies, magazines, and conversations, Thomas's mind kept replaying the way Henry T. Marchant had been treated. It stayed stuck like an unwanted scene that refused to fade. He turned toward the passenger beside him, a young man probably in his 20s with a baseball cap worn backward and earbuds in his ears. Thomas lightly tapped him on the shoulder. "Hey," he said. The young man pulled out one earbud. "What's up?" he asked. "Did you see what happened earlier? That old man, they made him move from his seat and put him near the restroom." The young man nodded. "Yeah, kinda messed up. But what can you do, right?" Thomas stared at him. "You could say something," he said. The man shrugged. "Not really my fight." That answer hit Thomas harder than he expected. He leaned back and closed his eyes. His father used to say that silence was the deadliest thing in the world, something cowards wear like a mask. "It looks like peace, but if you look closer, it's not," he had said. Thomas didn't want to be a coward, yet he did not want to get kicked off the plane either. So he sat, silently simmering, biting the inside of his cheek. Meanwhile, down in row 31, Henry turned the page of his book slowly. He wasn't truly reading. His eyes kept drifting first to the aisle, then the window, and back again. At one moment, a flight attendant passed by without glancing at him and accidentally bumped his elbow. She didn't stop or apologize. Henry said nothing. He gently rubbed his forearm and then returned a photo to the book's inner cover. It was a black and white picture faded with age, showing 5 men in uniform, all smiling. One of them had his arm draped around a younger Henry T. Marchant who was smiling broadly. All but one of those men had long since left. Henry did not desire a plaque or any kind of ceremony. He simply wished for a brief moment of respect in his later years. A comfortable seat and some quiet, yet that moment had been taken away from him. The man now occupying seat 12B leaned toward the flight attendant with the ponytail and said, "Thanks again for handling that." His voice was not quiet. I paid extra for that aisle seat. I was not going to squeeze in next to some guy who reeks like a garage." She gave a quick nod, but said nothing. Thomas Grant heard this and realized that was the point beyond which he could no longer remain silent. He unbuckled his seatbelt, stood up, and headed toward the front galley of the plane. He was unsure what he would say or do, but continuing to sit there pretending nothing had happened was not an option anymore. Yet, as Thomas arrived at the front, someone else had already beaten him to it. What followed next would quiet every voice on the entire flight. Captain Roy Delaney stood in the doorway of the cockpit, his hand resting on the back of the pilot's chair, eyes surveying the cabin from front to back. He was not searching for turbulence or mechanical issues. Instead, what he observed was something impossible to overlook. At row 31 sat an elderly black man, his posture straight and gaze steady, sitting silently next to a bathroom door as though he belonged nowhere else. Roy had flown commercial jets for nearly 20 years. After serving in the Air Force for 10 years, Henry T. Marchant had witnessed countless unusual situations, entitled travelers, unruly drunks. Once even a dog had to be secured with zip ties to its carrier during the flight. But this was unlike anything he had seen before. Prior to takeoff, he noticed Rachel being moved from row 12. Curious, he later asked the gate staff for an explanation. One of them casually mentioned it was just a simple mistake, nothing more. They claimed their final reports were already being filed, yet Roy sensed deception, even when carefully disguised in official jargon. Now, soaring at 34,000 feet, his gaze fixed down the aisle. He resolved not to remain passive. In the back of the aircraft, Henry had stopped attempting to read and was gazing blankly out the small window, not focusing on anything specific. He was not angry, only weary, a fatigue not caused by physical exertion or waiting, but from once again being reminded that people could act as if you did not exist. Suddenly, the intercom buzzed. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Thank you for flying with us today. We will soon reach cruising altitude, and I ask the crew to momentarily halt service. I must step out briefly to address an issue directly." His voice was calm and steady, yet carried a significant weight. Passengers exchanged glances. Several paused their movies. A child whispered to his mother, "Did something happen in row 14? Thomas Grant turned in his seat, knitting his brows as he glanced back toward row 31. Henry did not move until the cockpit door opened completely. Captain Roy Delaney entered the aisle, his pace calm and purposeful, without hurry or drama. He walked past the first rows, offering a slight nod to a flight attendant who instinctively stepped aside. Passengers started to notice, their whispers spreading throughout the cabin. The man in seat 12B, who had taken Henry's original spot, glanced up, confusion turning into irritation. Delaney continued on, passing row 20, then 24, then 28, until he stopped at row 31. Henry looked up, surprised, as the cabin suddenly quieted. Delaney took a breath but made no announcement. He did not explain anything yet. Instead, he met Henry T. Marchant's gaze directly. With many eyes fixed on them, he raised his hand in a sharp, precise, respectful salute. For a moment Henry hesitated, then slowly lifted his own hand, not out of formal ceremony but as a gesture of recognition, a connection between two men who had worn the same uniform decades apart. Delaney's voice was firm and clear, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Mr. Marchant served 3 tours in Vietnam. He rescued 6 men from a fire at Da Nang in 1970. This man carries more bravery in his bones than most people will realize in a lifetime. The cabin was so silent one could have heard a pin drop. Then, a single person started clapping, followed by another two. Soon the entire plane burst into applause. Heads turned toward the back of the cabin, and a woman seated close to Henry wiped tears from her eyes. The flight attendant with the ponytail stood motionless by the beverage cart. Thomas exhaled deeply, feeling relief or perhaps pride that at last someone had risen, not with anger but with dignity. Henry T. Marchant remained silent, simply lowering his hand while his eyes met Delaney's. But the salute was merely the start. Delaney had not returned just to offer recognition. There was one more task he needed to complete. Nobody on that plane was prepared for what would follow. Captain Delaney kept his gaze steady, even as the applause dwindled and the murmurs among passengers resumed. He stood firmly in the narrow aisle near row 31, where the lights above flickered softly, casting a gentle glow on Henry's face. Delaney lowered his hand and took a measured step forward. "Sir," he said calmly, "may I escort you back to your original seat?" Henry blinked slowly, uncertain. "Back to 12B, Delaney affirmed. "That is where you were assigned, and that is where you belong." After a brief pause, Henry spoke quietly, so only Delaney could hear. "I don't want to bring trouble, son. I've had more than enough of that in my life." Delaney's lips formed almost a smile, expressing warmth and reassurance. "You're not causing trouble. You're fixing a wrong, and I'm here to ensure it stays fixed." Silence returned. Then Henry rose slowly, moving out of necessity rather than hesitation. The woman beside him shifted to give space, watching him with the reverence of a witness to something profound. Thomas Grant observed this quietly from row 14, his eyes fixed intently on the scene unfolding below. He could barely believe his eyes as the two men walked side by side down the aisle, one dressed in a full uniform, the other in soft brown clothes and well-worn shoes. They remained silent, no words needed between them. As they passed each row, passengers leaned forward eagerly. Some applauded, while others nodded quietly in approval. Even a man in business class set aside his laptop for the first time during the entire flight. When they arrived at row 12, the man dressed in a suit who was sitting in Henry T. Marchant's seat, the same one who had mocked the smell earlier saying it resembled a garage, looked up, clearly annoyed. The captain said calmly, "Sir, this seat is no longer yours." Squinting, the man replied skeptically, "Excuse me?" The captain responded firmly, "You heard me. This seat belongs to Mr. Marchant. You were never assigned here. You need to move." The man glanced around before letting out a forced laugh. "Is this some kind of joke? I paid extra for this seat." Delaney interrupted firmly. "I am not going to argue with you in front of the entire flight. You may move willingly, or I can have ground security meet us upon arrival." Silence fell. The man grumbled, gathered his belongings, and angrily marched toward the back of the plane. No flight attendant stepped forward to assist this time. Delaney turned to Henry and pointed to the aisle seat. "It's yours again." Henry sat down calmly and collected. Then Delaney surprised everyone by sitting down himself right in the middle seat beside him. The cabin buzzed with quiet talk. Someone whispered, "You really didn't have to do that, son." Henry T. Marchant whispered, and Rachel smiled. "This time I want to." For the remainder of the flight, the captain stayed in that center seat. He responded to questions when passengers leaned closer. He took a photo for a child in row 13, seat C. And when the drink cart came by, he handed Henry a ginger ale, saying, "On the house." Back in seat 31, the toddler was now asleep. The atmosphere felt somehow lighter. Thomas Grant leaned back in his chair and finally let himself relax, watching Henry drink from the plastic cup. As if nothing had ever happened, as if he had always been in that spot, but everyone was noticing now. A girl in seat 15D quickly sketched the scene, just a simple drawing of two men sitting side by side. One with silver hair holding a book, the other in uniform. They would all remember this flight for a very long time. Yet what most passengers did not realize, and only a few would later discover, was the true reason. Henry had been relocated at the start, and when the truth emerged, it would cast a shadow no apology could erase. The mood inside the cabin had shifted, not just in feeling but in the way people looked at one another. More thoughtful, more aware. No one was tapping on screens or flipping through magazines anymore. Eyes kept moving toward row 12, where two men now sat shoulder to shoulder, one a retired veteran, the other still a captain in uniform. They acted not out of rules, but from something more profound. Some passengers tried to return to normal routines, whispering about the delayed flight and drinking lukewarm coffee, but it did not stick. There was something about what had just taken place that lingered deeply in the air. The atmosphere lingered in row 12A, where the teenage girl who had been there from the beginning finally glanced up from her phone and softly asked, "Sir, were you really in Vietnam?" Henry T. Marchant turned, surprised by her voice, and replied, "Yes, ma'am, a long time ago. Did you really rescue 6 people from a fire?" Henry offered a faint, weary smile. "I just did what anyone would have done. We were in a tough situation. In those moments, you don't think too much. You just act." The girl nodded slowly, biting her lip thoughtfully. Then she did something even she could not explain. She reached into her bag, pulled out a chocolate chip cookie wrapped in a napkin, and handed it to him. "For your great-grandchild," she said so quietly it was almost inaudible. "Or maybe just for you." Henry accepted it as though it were a medal. Across the aisle, Thomas Grant noticed the exchange and smiled without intending to. Further along the plane, a few whispers started to ripple through the passengers. Why had he been moved in the first place? Did someone complain that it was unfair, or simply wrong? The murmurs were low but traveled enough for the flight crew to catch them. In the galley, the flight attendant with a ponytail stood rigid, arms crossed, her eyes flicking between the cabin and the service checklist before her. She had not spoken since the salute. Another flight attendant, older with a tired expression, leaned in close and said quietly, "You need to tell the captain I did nothing wrong." The younger woman hissed. "You bypassed the seat assignment rules," the older woman whispered. "That was wrong, and you know it." The younger flight attendant stiffened and replied, "The desk crew told me it was fine." "No, you told the desk staff to record it as a misunderstanding. I heard you." She said nothing back in row 12. Captain Delaney pulled out a small notebook from his jacket pocket. He wrote a few words, folded the paper, and passed it to Henry. "Give this to your granddaughter. It is not much, just a note of confirmation. But if anyone ever questions what took place today, this will prove that someone witnessed it." Henry accepted the note, nodding once. "Thanks, son." They remained silent for a moment, listening to the steady drone of the engine and the faint rustling of luggage shifting above. Then from a few rows ahead came a voice. "Thank you, sir." It belonged to a man wearing a plaid shirt, likely in his mid-40s. "My dad served too. He did not always receive the respect he earned." Henry glanced at him and gave a slight nod. More voices joined in. "You should never have been moved. That was unfair. Glad you are back where you belong." Henry did not reply to every comment he did not have to. Sometimes presence speaks louder than words, and Delaney, he simply sat still, legs, crossed hands resting calmly in his lap as if having nowhere else to be, because at that moment there was no place better. Yet as the flight grew quiet once more, a private talk was already unfolding among crew members up front. The real reason behind Henry's transfer was on the verge of being revealed up front behind the thin galley curtain dividing the crew from the first few rows of travelers. Tension was building like boiling water left on the stove too long. The senior flight attendant Denise Langley, 28 years with the airline. Rachel crossed her arms and gave the younger woman a look that needed no words. "Do you want to explain now?" Denise said softly. "Or wait until Roy confronts you himself?" Alyssa kept staring at the floor, her name badge slipping from the edge of her blouse. Reflexively, she tucked it back in, anything to avoid their gaze. "I never meant for it to become a problem," she murmured. Denise raised one eyebrow. "You moved a Vietnam veteran from his paid seat to the back of the plane, and now the captain is sitting beside him. Half the passengers are whispering, so yes, it definitely is a problem." Alyssa clenched her jaw. "The man who asked for 12 Bravo is one of our platinum-tier frequent flyers. He didn't want to be seated next to that gentleman." Denise leaned in with a low and sharp voice. "You mean Henry T. Marchant?" Alyssa remained silent. "So you fabricated an excuse about a seating error just to keep one man comfortable, at the expense of someone who probably has more honors than the person in row 1 ever will." "I was trying to prevent a scene." "Well, congratulations. You created a bigger one than you realize." From just outside the curtain, a crew member coughed softly as a subtle warning. Captain Delaney was approaching again. Denise turned and left first, while Alyssa froze. The captain stepped into the galley. "Denise," he said, nodding once. Then his eyes shifted to Alyssa. "Do you have a moment?" Alyssa did not reply at first. She simply stepped aside as he entered. He did not raise his voice or blame anyone. His tone remained calm. "I just want to understand how a confirmed seat assignment for a military veteran and someone with early boarding privileges was changed at the last moment." Rachel swallowed nervously. It was not meant as a personal attack. The captain, a frequent flyer, was upset about the passenger beside him. "I tried to resolve it quietly without causing a scene." Delaney squinted sharply and asked, "So you gave his seat away?" "Yes, to the person who arrived first, who had the correct ticket, who did not protest, and obeyed all the guidelines." She nodded silently. Delaney lowered his voice when he said, "When I was 26, I flew combat operations over Basra. On one mission, we ran out of fuel halfway and had to land in enemy territory. My wingman did not survive. The man who saved me was black. He carried me for half a mile while under fire, despite bleeding from his own injury. That was no simple seat mix-up." Rachel looked down at her hands. Delaney sighed. "When we land, you will be writing a report. I will be submitting one as well. I refuse to ignore something like this. Not today, not ever." She nodded, but remained silent. Delaney left her standing in the galley and headed toward the cockpit. Passing row 14, he stopped. "Thomas, right?" he asked. The man blinked, surprised. Yes, that is me." "Thank you," Delaney said, "for noticing, for caring." Thomas gave a small shrug and replied, "I did not think I had much choice." "You did," Delaney said, "and you took the right one." Without waiting for a reply, he moved on. In row 12, Henry sat quietly, folding a napkin. The cookie arrived in a flawless little square, unaware of the discussion that had taken place in the galley. He had no idea the truth had finally been revealed. Yet the change in the atmosphere spoke volumes. People moved differently now, spoke in new tones, and looked at him not with sympathy, but with a kind of respect usually reserved for memorials or folded flags presented to widows. However, Henry T. Marchant had not flown to be honored. He had come to meet someone. That moment was approaching at last. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the pilot's voice returned to the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have begun our initial descent into Colorado Springs. Please return to your seats, fasten your seatbelts, and stow all belongings." It was the standard announcement, but nothing about this final part of the journey felt routine. Row 12 fell silent. Henry leaned back, the cookie still untouched on the folded napkin. He had said little in the past 30 minutes, not due to unease but deep thought. The gravity of what had happened weighed heavily on him, even though he never sought it. Captain Delaney was back in the cockpit. His voice over the intercom was the same calm, measured tone, but the man behind it had clearly shifted focus. He was no longer just piloting the plane. He was setting an atmosphere. Thomas Grant observed Henry from across the aisle. Throughout most of the flight, he had struggled with whether to approach him directly. Now, with landing only moments away, he felt it was more important than ever. So he leaned slightly toward Henry and said, "I just wanted to tell you that I noticed what they did to you. That was unfair." Henry's face remained calm and unreadable. Thomas continued, "I thought about speaking up but did not at first. I will not forget how you handled it with such grace. I am not sure I could have done the same." Henry looked at him for a moment, then replied, "You eventually spoke up. That is more than most would do." Thomas swallowed hard and nodded. "You are on your way to visit family, your great-grandson," Henry said softly. Just then, a woman across the aisle leaned over and said, "He's lucky to have you. Everyone on this plane witnessed what happened today." Henry gave a faint smile and said, "I hope he grows up in a world where we no longer have to keep relearning the same lessons." As the plane began to descend, more passengers started approaching, some shy and some straightforward. A mother with 2 boys walked over during the final taxi and said, "My dad served in Vietnam too. He did not talk about it often, but I wish he had lived long enough to see someone get the recognition he deserved." Henry shook her hand gently, feeling proud to be part of something larger. Even the teenage girl in seat 12A, shy and uncertain, said, "If my dad had seen what happened, he would have done something too. I am going to tell him about you." Her words were not perfect, but they were genuine, and Henry valued them more than anyone could realize after the plane finally touched down. The final taxi was calm when the seatbelt sign turned off. No one stood up immediately. People remained seated, not from confusion but out of respect, allowing Henry to move first. As he rose, the captain came out of the cockpit again, this time holding a folded sheet of paper. He stopped Henry at the front of the plane saying, "Mr. Marchant, one more thing." Curious, Henry looked up. Delaney handed him the paper. "This is a contact at our Veterans Partnership Division. They want to discuss the possibility of you sharing your story on your own terms if you are willing," he explained. Henry accepted it quietly, not replying at first. "Stories like yours truly matter," Delaney continued. "I'm only one man," Henry said. "One man can inspire others to rethink their actions." "I witnessed it today," Delaney answered. Henry glanced around. Passengers watched, still seated. Thomas gave a subtle wave and tipped his hat once. "Thank you, Captain," Delaney said, offering a firm handshake. "No, sir, thank you," Henry replied as he left the jet bridge. His pace was steady, calm but confident. Back on the plane, travelers began to rise slowly, many still absorbing what had just happened. Some had recorded the salute, others had not, yet everyone had felt its impact. Even after the cameras switched off and the door closed behind him, Henry's day was far from over. Waiting just beyond baggage claim was the core reason he had taken this flight. Outside Gate B7, the terminal hummed with its usual hectic energy. Arrival boards flickering, weary passengers dragging rolling suitcases, and airport announcements mingling with the murmur of voices and clattering carts. But Henry T. Marchant was oblivious to it all. He moved deliberately, though slowly, scanning the throng while clutching a plain envelope in one hand, the letter Captain Delaney had entrusted to him. In his other hand, he held a small stuffed elephant, a modest keepsake he had grabbed at the airport gift shop before boarding, a tiny symbol of a new beginning. Then he spotted her, Rachel, in her mid-30s, wearing a navy hooded sweatshirt, her hair tied back and swaying gently as she carried a baby carrier in one arm. She waved with the other hand, her eyes already glistening with tears. Papa Henry smiled, genuine and vulnerable for the first time all day. He hurried toward her, moving as quickly as his legs could carry him. She met him halfway, wrapping her arms around his neck before he could say a single word. "You made it," she murmured. "You doubted me," he replied, his voice rough yet tender. She pulled back slightly to lift the carrier. "Meet Miles." Henry bent down, his eyes searching the tiny face wrapped in soft blankets. A feeling stirred in his chest, something beyond pride or happiness, something more complex, weightier. In that moment, looking at the child he had waited a lifetime to meet, Henry did not just see a baby. He saw an opportunity, a chance for life to change. Henry T. Marchant hoped for a future where the child could live in a world without anyone ever needing to ask him to move, just so others could feel comfortable. He carefully placed the small elephant next to the baby's hand and softly said, "You don't realize it now, little man, but this world has challenges ahead, and you'll be helping just by being who you are." Rachel wiped away a tear and asked, "Are you all right, Papa?" Henry stood up and replied, "Yes, just thinking about what I want to say to him when he grows older." She smiled gently. "There will be plenty of time for that. You will share in everything, the first steps, first words, all of it." They sat silently for a moment near the baggage carousel. Rachel handed him a sandwich she had prepared, his favorite turkey with a hint of mustard. Words felt unnecessary between them at that moment. After a pause, Rachel finally spoke. "Was the flight okay?" Henry chuckled quietly. "Let's just say it had a few unexpected moments." Noticing his fatigue, she said, "You look tired." He answered, "I'm fine," but then hesitated before continuing. "Something happened on the plane I didn't see coming." Concern crossed her face, yet Henry dismissed it. "Don't worry, it turned out all right. Some people did what was right, and that's what counts." She studied him carefully, sensing there was more to the story, but chose not to press. Instead, she reached out and gently rested her hand on his, saying, "You've always inspired others to be better." His eyes narrowed with a playful grin. "Are you saying I made the world feel guilty enough to develop a conscience?" Laughing, she replied, "No, I'm saying people saw you and remembered what kindness truly looks like." Their luggage arrived and Rachel rose to collect it. Henry remained seated, allowing the moment to unfold slowly. He looked down at Miles, peacefully napping in the carrier. In that small face, Henry found something inexplicable. A symbol for all the dreams he once held about what the world could become. Yet, even as he clung to that hope, he understood the lesson was not yet complete. There was one final message to share. A message for anyone who might find themselves in that aisle, hesitating between speaking out or remaining silent. 3 days after Henry T. Marchant returned home, the airline issued a brief statement. It did not mention him by name, nor did it refer to a salute, a veteran, or the fact that the captain had momentarily left the cockpit to do what was right. The statement simply said they were reviewing an incident on Flight 2228 involving a seating dispute, and were committed to ensuring that all passengers are treated with respect and fairness. That was all. No apology, no press briefing, no public recognition of the true events. However, Henry did not seek the spotlight. That flight was never about making noise, but about reminding everyone how silence can speak volumes, and how a single act of kindness can outshine a room full of spectators. He was not expecting thanks. He had already received all the gratitude he needed the moment a little girl, Rachel, gave him a cookie. The instant the captain quietly saluted him, and when the young man in row 14 spoke up saying, "That was not right," those real, unpolished moments were more than enough when he was at home. Henry sat comfortably in his preferred chair on the porch, gently rocking back and forth as the afternoon sun slowly sank toward the horizon. The folded letter from Captain Delaney lay tucked in the side pocket of his well-worn jacket. Nearby, a framed photograph of Rachel rested on the table, where baby Miles sat quietly. Henry did not dwell on the event repeatedly, nor let it consume him with bitterness. He had endured far worse moments in his lifetime. However, he did reflect on the reactions of others, realizing that once a single person found the courage to stand up, it only took one to spark change. He remembered the man who gave up his seat, the one who refused to sit beside an elderly black veteran. That man vanished down the aisle like smoke, avoiding words and eye contact altogether. Yet Henry no longer felt anger toward him, perhaps only a tinge of pity or a sense of disappointment. That man could have deplaned carrying a story about grace, honor, and a newfound understanding of the world. Instead, he stepped away diminished in spirit. A few days later, Thomas Grant sent Henry a photograph captured by another passenger seated 2 rows behind. In the picture, Henry stands in row 31, while the captain salutes and all eyes focus on him. Beneath the image, Thomas had simply written 2 words: "Changed me." Henry smiled upon seeing it. Dignity did not require shouting or grand displays. It only needed to remain present long enough to be felt by others. And when someone truly noticed it, the atmosphere changed. That was the legacy Henry wished for his great-grandson. No awards, no headlines, just the inner drive to do what is right, even when it causes discomfort, especially at that moment as the sun sank beneath the horizon. Henry leaned back and closed his eyes. In his mind, he could still hear the words Rachel had spoken. In front of everyone in the cabin, that man has every right to sit wherever he chooses. It was never about the seat itself. It was always about being acknowledged, about being recognized, about being human. If you ever face a situation where remaining silent seems easier than speaking up, remember Flight 228. Remember the aisle. Remember the salute. Be the person who does not wait for permission to act justly. If this story made you stop for a moment, stirred your emotions, or brought to mind someone dear to you, press subscribe. We need more people sharing stories that remind us all of our responsibility to one another, even when high above the earth at 30,000 feet.